Hello everyone, and welcome back to Maths. Today is going to be the last video for the first section of the Fundamentals of Algebra series, which means we're going to be finally moving on a bit from this number line stuff, and next up is a review on fractions where we're going to look at some various perspectives with that'll be useful in algebra. But before we get into that, we need to finish up. And there's one thing that we haven't really talked about yet, which is doing negative times negatives or negative divided by negatives, stuff like that. So we're going to be looking at that. So just as a review, what is multiplication on the number line? So just as a review, multiplication on the number line stretches it out. So if we multiply this number line by 2, all the distances between ticks would get stretched out to be 2 times as long, which will look something like this. All right, and we saw that division on the number line kind of does the opposite, it compresses it. So when we divide, all of these distances become 2 times smaller than they were before. And there was another thing that we saw that we're going to be using today, which was the applying a minus. So for applying a minus, we take our number line, and if we apply a minus to it, that flips the number line, right? So all our negatives go on the right side, all our positives go on the left side because we've applied this negative, right? And so one way that we saw we could consider negatives is by either multiplying -1 or dividing -1. For example, -3 was the same thing as 3 times -1, or it could also be the same thing as 3 divided by -1. We also saw some other perspectives like 0 minus 3 and 0 plus -3, but we're not going to be using those today. So let's just focus on these ones. So our goal here is basically to get a way of showing a positive times a positive, positive times negative, negative times positive, negative times negative, and then similarly we want positive divided by positive, positive divided by negative, negative divided by positive, and negative divided by negative. And if you've been watching the exercise videos, which I would strongly recommend you do, we've already actually covered a few of these. So, of course, we know that positive times positive is positive and positive divided by positive is positive because we've been doing that with the number line already, right? When we stretch out the numbers or when we compress the numbers, we see that, yeah, the positives stay the same. The positives are always to the right of 0, regardless of what positive number we multiply or divide by. So every positive, even though it gets stretched or compressed, is always to the right of 0, so it will remain positive. And we can actually use this logic for negative times positive and negative divided by positive, where if we look at these number lines, we'll see that, hey, all the negatives are to the left of 0, right? When we stretch out the number line, the negatives remain on the left of 0 because 0 is fixed, right? And similarly, when we compress the number line, all our negatives stay to the left of 0 because 0 stays fixed, right? Even though we're compressing it, our directions don't change at all. So we see that multiplying and dividing by a positive keeps the sign of what we had before. Positives stay the same, negatives stay the same. And that accounts for these cases here, where we have a positive times a positive, negative times positive, positive divided by positive, negative divided by positive, because in all 4 of those cases, the number that we're doing the action with is a positive number, right? Stretching by a positive number or dividing by a positive number. And in one of the videos, we also looked at doing a positive times a negative. The reason we could also do that is if we had something like 3 times -4, we could just as easily say that's the same thing as -4 times 3, right? Because multiplication, the order doesn't matter. And in doing so, what we're able to do is we're basically able to transform this situation here into this one where we have a negative times a positive, which is something that we were able to model using the number line stretching. So this case here is also one that we've covered. But we still have to worry about these cases where we're multiplying by a negative or we're dividing by a negative. Because in this case with multiplication, it doesn't matter the order we do it in, we're always multiplying by a negative, so we can't get out of it like we did here. And for these ones, order with division does matter, right? 4 divided by 2 is not the same thing as 2 divided by 4, right? They're different things. We can't just say, oh yeah, we'll just switch it like we did over here and we'll be good to go. No, we actually have to consider what division by a negative looks like. So we've gone so far with dividing by the positives and multiplying by the positives, but now we have to bite the bullet and actually multiply and divide by negatives and see what that looks like on the number line. All right, so let's turn our attention to multiplying by negatives. So let's say I take a number line here and I want to multiply it by -2. All right, so I want to multiply this by -2. And I've been omitting the parentheses a lot, but you can also include it if you want to make it really clear that this is multiplying by -2 and not subtracting 2 or anything like that. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to break this down into two parts, right? If you look at the video name, it's called Mr. Multi-Action. So it's implying that there's maybe multiple actions going on with this multiplication by -2. So what are the two parts of this? Well, we have the multiplication, right? And we have the negative portion. So we saw before that multiplying by -1 was the same as applying a negative, right? And that flipped the number line. So let's take that portion here with the negative, and we will flip the number line. So we have our number line here, and I'm going to flip it. That is basically us applying the negative part of multiplying by -2. We flipped it. And now we can apply the multiplication by 2 part. Now what that's going to look like is everything will be 2 times longer than it was before with 0 fixed, right? So this is where 1 was, but now we're doubling that length. Now it's over here. Similarly, -2, -3, -4, -5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right? So we've taken this number line and we've multiplied it by 2. But ultimately what we did is we applied a negative and multiplied by 2. And that is what multiplication by -2 looks like. So now we're going to compare this with the number line we started with. We see that 0 lines up with 0, which is fine because 0 times anything should be itself, right? And 0 was fixed the whole way, whether we flipped it or we stretched the number line. Let's try another one. Let's go with 3. All right, so what's 3 times -2? So we have 3, that lines up with 6, which lines up with -6, which means that 3 times -2 equals -6. All right, what about 4? 4 lines up with 8, which lines up with -8. So that means 4 times -2 equals -8, right? So what we see here is that everything to the left of 0 is lining up with negative numbers. But all of these down here are positives, right? So we're saying that all the positives line up with negatives. The reason for this is the negative we applied here, right? It switched the direction. And by switching the direction, it means our positives are going to line up with negatives, which means that anytime we multiply by -2, because it involves this direction switch, we are going to be getting a negative result when we do a positive times a negative because we've switched the direction and hence are getting a positive direction being changed to a negative direction, which means that we can go back here and see that a positive times a negative is going to be negative, right? So that's another way we can see how that gets done. But now we can also look at the negative times a negative case, where if we look at all these negatives, let's try -1 times -2, for example. Where does that line up with? Well, -1 lines up with -2, which lines up with 2, which means that -1 times -2 equals 2. And we could try another one. Let's say -5. -5 times -2. Well, this -5 lines up with -10, which lines up with 10, right? So this was from the negative flipping, and then this was from the stretching, right? So multiplying by -2 was basically stretching the number line and flipping it. And the flipping portion meant that our negatives, all of our negatives here, are going to be lining up with positives, right? Because we've flipped the direction from negative to positive. So that means what we're going to get is that a negative times a negative will give us a positive, and that covers this case right here. So now we can basically summarize this. Positive times a positive. We're doing a stretch, and we're not changing the direction. So this is going to be positive. Positive times a negative. We're doing a stretch, which is the multiplication, and we're applying a flip from the negative number. So this is going to give us a negative. Negative times a positive. We're doing a stretch, and we're not changing the direction, but the direction we started with here was negative, right? So that means this is going to be negative. And a negative times a negative, well, we are applying a stretch from the multiplication, and because we're stretching by a negative number, we are also going to be flipping, right? That's the second action of multiplication by a negative. And thus flipping will take us from the negative world into the positive world, which means a negative times a negative will yield us a positive number. All right, and it's going to be very similar for division. So why don't you try and reason it yourself before we get into it? All right, so let's say I take this number line and I want to divide it by -2. All right, so what's that going to look like? Well, once again, we have a negative, right? So we can immediately treat this negative as essentially flipping our number line, right? We saw that applying a negative to a number was the same as the number divided by -1. So we can think about this division by a negative as essentially flipping our number line, right? So we're going to take our number line and we're going to flip it. All right, great. And now we can actually focus on the dividing by 2 portion, right? We just did the negative part of it, but now we need to do the dividing by 2, which is the compression, right? So compressing this number line down, these distances of 2 are now going to be 2 times smaller, which means there'll be a distance of 1. So -1 is going to be here, -2 is going to be here, and so on. All right, so now let's look at some examples and see if we can get the bigger picture. So let's do 10 divided by -2. So 10's right here. Dividing by -2 will take us all the way over to -5, right? Because it lines up with -5. So that means 10 divided by -2 equals -5. So the division by 2, right? That's compressing it. That's where we get the 5. And then the negative, that is flipping our direction, right? That was this part here. So flipping the direction took us from the positive world into the negative world, which is why we got a negative answer. Let's try another one. Let's go with 4. 4 divided by -2. Well, that lines up with -2. So we compressed it, so that means 4 lined up with the 2, but we also applied a negative, right, which was the flipping part, and that's why we end up lining up with -2, not just +2. So our positive number dividing by a negative resulted in a negative. And we see because there was a flip involved in this double action of dividing by the negative, that means all our positive numbers are going to line up with negative numbers. Similarly, all our negative numbers are going to line up with positive numbers. Let's do an example. For example, -3 divided by -2. So we see here -3 divided by -2. That lines up with -1.5, 1.5. Right, so it lines up with a positive number at the very start here, right? This is just an intermediate step, so don't get confused by thinking this is where your final answer is going to be. We need to look at where our transformed number line lines up with where we started. All right, and let's try another one. Let's go -8. -8 divided by -2. That is going to be, well, that lines up with +4, right? So we got the 4 from compressing the number line, that was the dividing by 2, and the negative portion, that flipped the number line, which took us from a negative to a positive. So what we get from both of these is that positive divided by negative, that is negative, right? Because that involves not just a compression, but also a flipping from the positive world to the negative world. And a negative divided by a negative, that yields a positive because it involves a compression, but it also involves a flipping of direction, and since we started in the negative world, we had to flip into the positive world. All right, so what we've seen today is that multiplication by negatives and division by negatives is really just two actions in disguise, where we have the regular compressing and stretching that we're used to, but the inclusion of a negative also involves a flipping, and that's why it changes the direction that we're going. So when we're multiplying by a negative, we're stretching and changing the direction, which is why a positive times a negative is a negative, because we started with a positive and there was a flipping, so we switched to negative, and a negative times a negative is a positive, because there was a negative and we switched to being a positive from the flipping of the negative multiplication. And similarly, we saw that positive divided by a negative was negative because the division by a negative not only compressed but also flipped, which meant we went from positive to negative, and we saw negative divided by a negative was a positive because not only did division by the negative compress the number line, but it also flipped the direction we were going. So try some examples, and of course you don't have to visualize number lines every single time, but again, the point of these number lines is to really give us more of a mature and a more different perspective on these fundamental arithmetic ideas that we're going to be using later on in algebra. But that's going to do it for me today. The next video, of course, will be the exercises video, and then after that, instead of a lecture video, there's actually going to be a checkpoint. And the checkpoint is basically going to be kind of a little quote-unquote test where it'll review a lot of different concepts that we've learned throughout these last several videos. So go back, review the videos, review some practice questions, and then I hope you give the checkpoint quiz on a shot and see how you do. But until then, have a good one, stay groovy, and I'll see you in the next video.